Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here to PyData Seattle 2023. And I'm very happy for all you. Thank you. Thank you all for supporting our open source community. And I'm Eloise Elias. And I'm very happy to be here to give you the opening statements. And so for everybody to know, this is our password for the Wi-Fi, and please take a photo. And I would like to thank you all our sponsors that make everything in this conference possible. And please help me to say thank you to our sponsors with a very strong claps. Thank you so much. And we are PyData Seattle. We are a meetup that started in 2017 and is made by all volunteers. And we have diverse backgrounds, and we are presenting data science related topics. And please join us to meetup.com at PyData Seattle. And PyData is a worldwide meetup group that is provided by NumFOCUS for us to have an open source space where we can present our latest topics in data science. And please, you can find any, as you can see in the map, any meetup near to your country or state. And for now, please help me to bring our Executive Director, Leah Silent, to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to see everyone here, and it is super exciting to be back for another PyData in the Seattle area. It has been way too long. So a huge thank you to Microsoft again for support and for the incredible venue. It's such a pleasure to be back here, and we're grateful also we will give a shout out to Microsoft also for the support for the New York City venue as well. Very grateful for that. So thank you for coming. It's the community, the whole NumFOCUS community and open source scientific community is huge, and it seems to be growing every day. And NumFOCUS is here to support the projects that you are using and that the community is working on, but also that so many in the community are contributing to both code and non-code contributions. It's great to see also growth in the contributor base, and we greatly encourage everyone who isn't contributing to a NumFOCUS open source project or another project to go to the contributor guidelines, check those out, see if there's a way for you to get involved. We make sure all NumFOCUS projects have a real easy point of entry. So think about contributing in that way or volunteering for NumFOCUS. We're here to support the projects and also you, the user community. And we would love to have your participation and involvement, whether it's with events or meetups or some of our volunteer committees that we have growing right now. So be sure you check those out on our website. We have lots of opportunities for you to get involved. And as NumFOCUS continues to grow, we're really taking a year to carefully look at how we can scale. There's a lot of projects that want to be under the NumFOCUS umbrella that need these project services so they can continue on their growth cycle, and we can ensure their sustainability. So we're really taking a look back also at where we've come over the last, now we're in our 11th year, and where we're going and exactly how we can get there most efficiently so that we can serve these projects and also serve the community in the best way that we can. So super excited to be here. Thank you to you. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Your impact is huge. Please know how much of a difference that makes. We count on it, and it helps us to do the work that we're here to do and fulfill that mission. And yes, thank you, sponsors. And also want to thank everyone who's presenting, who give those who presented tutorials yesterday and those who will be speaking today. Everyone's here to come gain knowledge, exchange that knowledge with each other, and we couldn't do that without the incredible content that we have that speakers are delivering. So thank you so much to you, and also all the volunteers. Couldn't be another great PyData event without you. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Leah. So with that note, please help me to welcome the representative of Microsoft, Andres Muller.
Good morning, everybody. So it's a new thing for me to be the representative of Microsoft. I've been involved in the PyData community probably for at least 10 years. I'm a secular core developer for over a decade. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome you all on the Redmond campus on behalf of Microsoft. So I'm really excited that we can host the conference again here together in person. And so I'm really excited for the talks. I actually don't want to take away any more time from the amazing keynote we all have, and I hope I can see you all during the coffee breaks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Microsoft, for hosting us. And we have a code of conduct. Please be excellent to each other, and please we have this a link in your information for the ticket for attending the conference, and we have many volunteers for this for today program. We also have 4 keynote, 16 tutorials that was yesterday, and 42 talks between today and tomorrow. And please attend our 2 panels event. One is a diversity panel, and that one I would like to encourage everyone to attend, so you can get knowledge and how to become a better ally, and you are going to hear very cool stories from us. And I really appreciate NumFOCUS personally and PyData, because I'm a woman. I'm come from Mexico, and English is my second language, and I'm here in front of you talking, and I'm very happy and honored to be here. Thank you so much. And our meals are tomorrow, every day, breakfast 8 to 9, and lunch daily. And the food is amazing in here. I really like it. And we have our social event today. Please stay and networking with us. And we have 3 sponsors for our social event. And could you please help me to thank our sponsors for the social? It's going to be amazing. We are going to have drinks and appetizers. And these are okay. These are all the people from the PyData Seattle Conference Committee. And we are volunteers, as I said at the beginning. And please help me to thank all of us that made this conference possible. We spent many, many hours for you to have a great time here and to bring you the best of data science right now in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you so much to all the volunteer committee. And also thank you so much to the speakers, volunteers, contributors, and to all our friends, NumFOCUS and PyData friends. And with this, I would like to introduce, I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Katrina Riehl. She is the President of the Board of Directors of NumFOCUS. Thank you.
All right. So first off, I just want to thank everybody for inviting me here. This is a really great honor to be back here at the Microsoft Center here in Seattle. Fun fact, this is actually the first conference center, in fact, the same room where I gave my very first conference talk ever at a PyData event back in 2015, actually. So it's pretty cool to be back here. But I do want to talk a little bit about my story and how I wound up kind of getting where I'm at. As mentioned before, this is actually kind of an interesting story, and it kind of explains a little bit about what I'm talking about here. I came to open source through scientific computing. So my undergraduate degree is in molecular biology. I worked in a population genetics lab, and we were doing a huge amount of number crunching back in Excel and sometimes Mathematica. And it was really, really painful, just so you know. It was not the best experience. My older brother at the time was working at NASA. He was working on the International Space Station guidance system, which was written all in C, and they were actually using Python in order to test the code, which was pretty cool. He came to visit. He really wanted to see my lab, and he kind of saw what I was doing, saw me suffering through some of the number crunching I was doing, and he said that maybe there was a better way for me to do this. And it opened this entirely new direction for everything I did after that. Obviously, I'm not a biologist anymore, and I moved on into an entirely different direction. The things that I really liked about using Python were basically the accessibility. It was freely available. We had open source tools that were of quality, that were available to all scientists. It was easy for me to teach it and share it. It was easy for me to learn it. It was easy for me to interact with the community. It was easy for me to ask questions of other scientists in order to understand what was going on and why we were using it in the way that we were. It's an interesting idea because you always hear this within this community, is that you come for the language, you stay for the community, right? We all are a part of this community, and we are all a part of this knowledge share that's involved here. So I took a turn in my career. I ended up moving into artificial intelligence, which was something that I really enjoyed. I ended up going into graduate school for computer science. And I got my first job my first job at an artificial intelligence startup that was founded by the former chief financial officer of Texas Instruments, actually. And I got really lucky. I was an officer in the ACM chapter on campus, and they gave a presentation talking about their brand new startup and how they were working in artificial intelligence, and they were using Python. At the time, obviously, no one was using Python. I was a huge fan already. I went to talk to them, and that's how I scored my first software development job. And that's where I wound up staying, actually, was in artificial intelligence. Working in R&D in artificial intelligence, especially with these really seasoned R&D people out of Texas Instruments, made me want to move in that direction. So I stayed in artificial intelligence and wound up actually going into a PhD program in computer science. At this point, I want to mention that Python was still not popular. I was the Python geek in the department that everyone made fun of, that everyone kind of, was, a lot of things thrown my way, actually, for being a part of the community. But it was also around this time that I became very involved in open source, as a lot of graduate students do when they move into a research setting and they are working on something. Generally, a lot of scientists, they are creating code in order to advance their own research, but then they want to share it with everybody else, that we do have the spirit of community, and we do have scientific inquiry, that we're moving these things forward. So I started working in open source while I was working on my PhD. By the way, all of the software that I created for my own research as a PhD student was open sourced as well. It was, at the time, we didn't have anything like GitHub. We had various SVN servers all over the place, or people would put, a tar file up on their website or something like that. We did have SourceForge, which was a really good resource for a lot of people to use. But it was a very different era in which people were creating software and sharing it with each other. I had this dream when I finished that I wanted to stay in the open source area. So when I finished my PhD, I joke about this, that the dream was to get paid to do open source. And this turned out to be way harder than actually getting my PhD. And so I had plenty of offers from industry in every area that I could possibly want to go. But this was the dream. This is where I wanted to go. I thought of myself as a scientist, even though I was still in the computer science area. And I wanted to support scientific computing. So a lot of people probably in this room, I wound up at NThought, who at the time was housing NumPy and SciPy. And so that's where I wound up. So I'm not going to go into all the places I bounced around after that. I worked in government, I've worked in industry, I've started data science teams at Cloudflare and at also with Verbo. I was part of that team, which is part of Expedia. Most recently, I was hired as the head of the data team over at Streamlit, and which was acquired by Snowflake. Recently, I retired, actually, so I am now an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University, and I also just do this. So the dream of doing open source full-time really came true because I sold out, and now I'm bringing my soul back, right? So that's what, thanks. I say that with love because I actually met amazing people along the way, and I'm very, very fortunate in my career. But it actually has been my dream, and it was by design that eventually I knew I was going to be leaving so that I could follow this dream of doing open source full-time and teaching. And that's what I'm doing now, as of last month, by the way. So that's how that went. I joined the NumFOCUS board of directors in 2018. I was really honored to be asked to join. Obviously, the board of directors, they do searches out amongst the community and find people who are active and ask them to join. So I came on as treasurer, actually. So I joke a lot about, I talk a lot about money for NumFOCUS, which you're going to get to later on in this talk. But I joke around a lot about, the treasurer is usually the most boring job on a board until you hit a pandemic. And then it becomes a lot more interesting. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I became the president of the board in 2021. Since then, I've been obviously just around. I recently, as of I guess last week, took over the PyViz project actually. So it's the first time I'm a project maintainer in a really long time. I'm really excited to get that back off the ground. So like I said, it's kind of an interesting story, but I don't think that it's an uncommon story for people in the scientific community. That you start off doing your own research, you find out that there's this community of sharing, you get really, really involved in it, and then we had all of these revolutions that happened, right? That Python took off, or scientific computing took off. Other languages came in to the scientific computing realm. We have, R coming in, we have Julia coming in, we have Stan coming in, we have all of these other things that are happening here, and you just move in another direction. It also, within this time, became big business, where people were able to make a living in these areas, and that scientific computing, array computing, became the de facto way that we approach data science, which has become this huge boom, just this huge bomb that's in the middle of this community. So I just want to kind of mention this because we're going to look back quite a bit, I think, during this whole thing. And I want to talk about open science quite a bit here because I actually do still consider myself a scientist. I know that's really funny at this point, but I do still consider myself ultimately a scientist. The core mission of NumFOCUS is actually to support scientific software and the scientific community. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. But when you look at open science, I want to lay the groundwork here so you can kind of understand how this interplay between open source and open science works. Because within open science, you have to have, obviously, open code so that you have reproducibility, you have scalability, you have multiple eyes on it, you're sharing knowledge, people are able to move forward with research, they're able to tap into a community of people that are making things better. Open data is obviously a really important thing, and that's something that we're getting into more and more. If you don't have data available, it's going to be really hard to do science. And this is something that I think that, especially within the government, you're seeing more and more data sets being shared, out of NASA, out of the Space Telescope, out of TOPS, out of a lot of different programs that are out there right now. Obviously, open papers. This is a big one that for a long time, scientific papers, they're behind a paywall. It's really, really hard to get access to good scientific research. And as part of this community, I think that we have shown ultimately that we can publish notebooks, we can publish papers, we can put things out into the open arena so that we can work on science as citizen scientists, as opposed to being a part of an academic institution or a part of, publishing within a journal that may or may not have open access. And then also open reviews. So open evaluation is a really big thing. And so this goes back to the idea of reproducibility, which is a big tenet of NumFOCUS as well, by the way. Reproducibility in scientific thought is obviously important. We want to make sure that when we are looking at something, that we can reproduce it, that the results are valid. And so we want to also do all of these things based on the principles of inclusion, fairness, equity, and sharing. Right? So the idea that everyone is invited to the table, that this is a conversation that is not just for some people, it's for everyone who chooses to be a part of it. And that's something that really appeals to me. And especially as somebody that, coming as a bench scientist, where it was almost impossible for me to do genetic research without $1,000 worth of chemicals and a vent hood and, $10,000 for my PCR machine and $5,000 for this or my centrifuge and all these other things like that. Suddenly, all I needed was a personal computer and an internet connection, and I was completely hooked into a scientific community, and I could do pretty much anything that I wanted to. It was only bound by my imagination and the amount of time I was willing to put into it. And to me, that was magic. And so, but I also want to mention that where we came from within the open source community. These are the events that I wanted to mention. There are several events in the milestones of open source, but I kind of want to walk you through some of these because they're the ones that shaped me quite a bit in my own view of open source and the influences I had in my own life. The first thing that I wanted to go back to, though, back in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of computers were very academic. This was something that, software was shared as part of your hardware. There was no such thing as an operating system back then. So it's a very different paradigm for people to think about. Code was open by default because it was a small community of academics mostly that were all sharing information with these brand new machines that were out there. But as things progressed on and suddenly the proliferation of computers happened, you have operating systems, there were actually court cases around the fact that it was anti-trust in order to bundle your computers with software. And so these things became separate things. It was the first time that software started being considered a commodity, that it itself had value because the cost of developing software rose relative to the cost of developing hardware. And you start seeing this sort of split that's happening here. You also have operating systems coming into play. You have other code that's coming into play. And then what happened as a result of this, 1974 is the first time that really it was aware of the fact that code is copyrightable. So this is where all of the licenses that we all love talking about, this is where it all starts, right? It's back in 1974 where suddenly code is copyrightable as if it were a work, as if it were authored by somebody, like a regular fiction book. It's something that is copyrightable. So that is still in play today, obviously. That's why we have all these fun licenses. I do want to mention the 1976 letter that Bill Gates wrote, the open letter to hobbyists, which hobbyists later became known as hackers. I know that we are on the Microsoft campus, but I do want to mention this because for me, this was very, very influential because it was the first time that somebody stood up and said, hey, we're not okay with people sharing our code, basically, that sharing things without a valid license. And that's where a lot of the conversation started around whether or not you need to have a license and what does it mean to have software on your machine and who is the person who owns it and what are your rights when you have this software. And it was definitely something that was referred back to multiple times, especially in my childhood, in my own household of nerds. And it was something that definitely shaped a lot of things. I do want to mention, as a result of this, by the way, that Microsoft is a very different place now than it was back then, right? They have a very large open source community, obviously, and a lot of their policies have changed. I'm only bringing this up basically because this open letter was so influential, I think, within the history and the milestones of open source. The next thing I wanted to talk about was 1983. The internet already existed. We know this, and there's a lot of debate about what the birth date of the internet is. I'm choosing 1983 for a reason. The reason is because we moved to TCP/IP. When we moved to TCP/IP, we suddenly had a uniform protocol that was open that everyone could conform to. Before that, the internet had a lot of proprietary interfaces that people were using. But what this did, by having an open standard, by having something that everyone could connect to and that could be implemented, suddenly you have an open communication gate that anyone can be a part of, once again. So this is 1983. So now we've got the substrate, right? We've got the means at which to be able to actually communicate with each other in an open way. Then 1983 was also when the GNU project started. So Stallman obviously was the person who started this, and not getting into the whole controversies around GNU and everything like that, but this is when the idea of copyleft came up, right? People were working on projects, they wanted to have these licenses, and then wanted to be able to keep it open. So if you had a GNU license on your software, it could be reused, but it was a copyleft idea, so it had to be attributed back, and it also had to stay open if you were going to work on this. And so this led, of course, into the Free Software Foundation, obviously very, very important in everything involving open source and shaping the way that we look at open source. 1989, I'm going to talk about the 386 BSD development started. And this is where the BSD license came from. The reason I actually bring this up, I don't think that the 386 BSD development was particularly groundbreaking, but the BSD license is, because this is the first time that you had a license where suddenly software was completely distributable. So this one came out of Berkeley, right? The Berkeley software distribution. And this led to the Apache license and the MIT license, which even to this day, Apache 3-clause, MIT license, BSD licenses, these are the most popular licenses we see, especially in the NumFOCUS community. And this allows free and fair use, where suddenly we don't have this copyleft restriction. We can use all of the software, reuse it in any way that we want to, basically. And that is a revolution, I think, in the way. So the idea being that we want to push adoption as opposed to attribution. So a lot of projects obviously move in this direction. Want to also discuss 1991 is when the Linux kernel, so Linus Torvalds, everyone's obviously heard of this. Suddenly in the open source world, we had a kernel in our operating systems that was fully open. So now we have the whole stack. We've got the internet, we've got a kernel for our operating system, we've got KDE, we've got all the open software that we need in order to move forward. It was possible for around the first time that you didn't have to buy any software in order to be able to get started and move forward. If you had a machine, it was very possible, if you're willing to hunt and peck and find everything that you needed to do, and obviously have a certain amount of savvy in order to be able to compile things yourself and get things running on your own. But you were able to actually do computing without having to go to proprietary software. And I mention this because one of the tenets of open source, I think sometimes people forget, is that we didn't want all of the power of this new computing world that we were a part of to be owned and restricted by certain entities, certain corporations, as being the ones who owned all of the IP and all of the ideas for this revolution in our world. So suddenly we want to be in this position where, especially within the scientific computing realm, we want to have tools that are freely available, that there is no barrier to entry, that people can use and be able to push forward thought. And that was what we really wanted, as opposed to using the commoditization of software and using that as a means to kind of control the market and control who has access. Okay. All right. I talked about, I added 1993, the founding of Red Hat. This is where we see for the first time that that open source is big business. When Red Hat was founded, this was a huge new idea. No one had ever started a company based on an open source project. And they not only succeeded, but when it actually hit and went public, it was one of the largest opening days of like any company ever up to that point, right? So this is where it suddenly, okay, I don't know what happened there, but okay. But yeah, we have, it opens the door for all of the others that came after this, right? So we have, it's too many to even name at this point, right? So it opened the door for everything from GitLab to Docker to Grafana, all of these other companies where we have open source software as being the basis for our company. So now we've moved back into a world where we have industry and science all working together. That there are all of these different things. We have money that's being poured into the community as well as a result of this. All right, so 1997, I added this one because the Raymond article, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, was probably one of the most influential things that I read back when I was in college. And so this was really shaped the way that I looked at software and the way that I thought about software. And if you haven't read it, it's actually, it's part of computer history. It's probably a good read, even to this day. But the idea that you have these two different ways of looking at software development. So you have the cathedral idea, where you have periodic releases of software, and in between, it's really opaque what happens in between that time. All the development happens kind of offline, often the group of people that are developing it. And the only time that you actually see it is when they do a release. And so a lot of people still use this, obviously. Nothing wrong with it. But the other way of looking at it is the bazaar idea. And Linus Torvalds was definitely a big influence in this one as well. The idea that you have as many eyes as possible on the software, that you're going to find the bugs, you're going to find the good ideas, and you're going to move forward in an open way. So this was software development in the open. And so obviously the bazaar idea has really, really taken off. GitHub is obviously the revision control of choice for most open source projects. And a lot of that is open, right? Once you have it out there, anyone can read it, anyone can comment on it, anyone can have an opinion about it. And so that puts us into that area. So having as many eyeballs on the code, the idea is that then we have more of a conversation. We're sharing knowledge. And I also just want to add that one of the things that really I took from this paper, it became a book later, but when you go through this, every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's itch. And that goes way back into the scientific software community, right? Where you have scientists developing software because something is very, very painful to them. So for example, number crunching in a population genetics lab. Not particularly fun, scratching that itch. All right, and then I added 1998 is when the open source initiative happened. This came out of the Open Source Summit. It was originally the Freeware Summit. It was renamed the Open Source Summit. It was hosted by Tim O'Reilly, the publisher. And there were a lot of people at the table that you've probably all heard of, including Guido van Rossum, who's the creator of the Python language. And that's where the actual term open source was coined. There was a vote, open source won. That was the term that everyone used. And there's a very pragmatic approach to open source. It's not necessarily the same thing as freeware or free software, but the open source community is generally where I am, and this is where we are sharing information. We are using OSI approved licenses. We are sharing software, and we are able to anyway, this gave us a common language, is what I'm getting at, I guess, is the way to look at this, is that now we have a vocabulary. We have a way to unify this area. I'm so sorry, everybody, by the way. I didn't expect this to go to sleep. But anyway, these are the ones that I chose. Anyone can pick other dates, but this is my view of the world and kind of the things that really shaped the way I looked at software. But then going back to, I'm very active in the Python community is where I started. Going back and looking at how all of these different packages and all of these different things that happened within our community all built upon each other. We have all standing on the shoulders of each other. And I know that many people in this room are developers on these projects or have been involved in these projects and definitely passionate users of these projects. But we see this over time, all the way from 1991, where Python was one of the first, completely open languages. Numeric, by the way, if you're ever part of the NumArray numeric debates, a lot of older people like me, dinosaurs, we went through that whole debate. And then obviously in 2005, NumPy was actually founded out of all of this. And Travis, he's one of our keynote speakers. He's the creator of NumPy, so he's probably not going to talk about that, but I thought it was a huge revolution at the time, especially as somebody who was a user back then. And so IPython, SciPy, Matplotlib, Cython, scikit-learn, we had Andras up here, who was one of the core maintainers of that one, started as a Google Summer of Code project, right? And we have Pandas, scikit-image, Numba, Jupyter, Dask, TensorFlow. There's so many projects. I could keep going on and on and on and on, but these are some of the really, really important ones that I think that you see a lot of adoption around. So I wanted to really shout those out. There's one thing that I did not add into this one is that in 2012, the formation of NumFOCUS is obviously super, super important. There are multiple foundations out there. Apache Foundation, Linux Foundation, you have all of these different entities that are helping out. But we'll get into NumFOCUS quite a bit and how we're a little bit different because we are supporting the scientific community. So from here, I just want to mention that these packages where we're all standing on the shoulders of each other, they are making a huge impact in this world. You see this in scientific thought and in scientific discoveries all the time. The first photographs of the black hole that we all saw, the laser interferometer gravitational wave observatory is the first time that we were able to see gravitational waves, right? These were predicted by Albert Einstein 100 years ago. And it was the first time that we were able to see really, really violent collisions in space using all of these tools that are out there and earned a Nobel Prize, rightly so. We have over 188,000 project citations in scientific papers out there. I think that number's low, to tell you the truth, because I think a lot of people don't realize that you can cite software packages in your papers. But there is actually a way to do that. The style guides now have that of how you can reference papers. But those are the ones that I saw in our impact report. Supporting technical innovation. All of these projects are everywhere. We've seen them distributed in all kinds of different things. I won't even go through all of them, but we see it over and over and over again that they're becoming ubiquitous in our world. And then the Google Collaboratory and Netflix, they're using a lot of Jupyter notebooks, a lot of things moving forward in that area. I know that, well, I won't get into the whole notebook thing because I think I'm actually running out of time. But and another one I wanted to shout out very self-servingly is the fight for human trafficking. I was one of the co-principal investigators of the DARPA MEMEX program, so we were using open source for the first time that was being funded by DARPA to release tools to fight human trafficking in an open way as part of the DARPA Open Catalog. This was a new way of looking at it. The idea was that suddenly you've reduced the barrier to entry for any law enforcement agency to have access to quality software in order to fight a common problem. And it was also a means by which the government was recognizing that open source as a means of distribution was a valid way to get software into the hands of others. And so, like I said, I could talk about this quite a bit. Actually, that's what I talked about when I was on the stage for the very first time, by the way. And I know that we have at least one MEMEX developer in here, but anyway. And then also, so we were mostly mining the deep and dark web when we were looking for rigs of human traffickers. And a lot of new tools, a lot of innovation came out of this because we were not bound by anything. We could use any of the open source projects, but we also were in the position that we could collaborate with any of the open source projects in order to build the tools that were necessary in order to do the things that we wanted to do on the project. So if there was a feature that was necessary, we could contribute it back. And suddenly we had a better library as the foundation for what we were trying to do. And I just thought it was a really great way to do research. And I would like to see more projects run this way. Unfortunately, the administration that came in after that was not as friendly to open source. They shut down the DARPA Open Catalog. We had a lot of trouble trying to find homes for all of the new things. But our current administration has a much more open view of that. They brought a lot of things back, as well as the open data that's available through the X-Data program was also made available again. All right, so why do I believe in open source? Democratization of technology, obviously. As a person who did not necessarily have a background in computers, I suddenly had access to all of these different tools that I could play around with, that I could program, that I could modify, that I could share. And I thought that was really, really cool. I also do want to mention that as a woman in technology, I have to say that having a supportive environment where I could collaborate with others was unbelievably necessary for me to be able to move in this direction. So being able to be in a position where technology should not be shut out from 50% of our population. It's just too much a part of our lives at this point. So if we are shutting people out, there are other ways and other roads for people to get involved. And I think that this is a very valid one. Freedom to adapt and alter code, as I mentioned before, tapping into the brain trust. We're all in this together. We all want to solve cool problems. We all want to do cool things. But we also can share ideas and get into that place where, wow, that's a really great idea. I'm either going to beg, borrow, or steal it. That's cool, because I can do that in this kind of environment. Education, I recently just finished teaching my first semester after a really, really long time of not teaching. Last time I taught was actually when I was at Anaconda, and I was doing like corporate trainings, which is not the same thing. But in education, suddenly we have all of these open tools that are freely available to students. So we're able to get people on the ground working with real code with some of the best programmers in the world as the ones who are guiding them, and then also be able to open that door. Like you can be on the very cutting edge of what's happening in your field, as opposed to, for example, in biology, where you may be a little bit constrained by what's available to you and who has access to the laboratory equipment and to all of the grant money and all of the different jobs in that particular, biochemistry field or something like that. Practical experience. I will admit that especially back when I started doing open source, you gotta have a pretty thick skin to contribute to an open source project. But like I said, if you are willing to put in the time and to work with other people, you have the opportunity to work on a real project with people who do know what they're doing and who are willing to teach you and hopefully are open to the idea of working with you in order to make you better at what you're doing. Business opportunities. I can't count the number of startups I've seen that are founded on open source projects. The ones that I always laugh about, I guess about 4 years ago, it's like every startup I heard about was founded on scikit-learn. It's like basically like, practically powering a whole portion of our economy at this point, right? If the projects were to fail, that obviously would be very detrimental, in fact, to our economy. Career opportunities, I personally recruit out of open source all the time. Well, I guess not anymore now that I'm not anybody anymore, but I love recruiting from open source communities because you see what people are capable of doing, but they also have the passion for the mission of what you're doing. Research and development costs go way down when you're working in open source. And open scientific inquiry and sharing, obviously. So this is where we finally get to NumFOCUS. So NumFOCUS is huge, and I am so sorry that we recently just had another round of affiliated projects that were added, so I don't think my counts are completely up to date on like how many projects we have, but a lot of these I'm sure you're all aware of. Our first, by the way, project to receive funding through NumFOCUS was IPython. And so that's kind of cool. That's like, what, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, that they received. That was the first time that we were able to pay open source developers through a fiscal entity entirely devoted to open source and open science. This is a revolution. I kind of sometimes want to make sure that people understand, like, it was the Wild West for Riehl back. You saw projects succeed and fail. And like I mentioned before, it was really, really hard to figure out a way to make a living and build a career as an open source developer. You had a lot of, like I said, just things people would disappear. Code would disappear. There were all kinds of different issues that would happen. The number of projects more projects I worked on failed than succeeded. And that was the norm. But by having an entity that is independent and scientifically oriented, suddenly we have a home where we can provide services to help these projects to be more successful. To be totally clear, we do not dictate any technical direction. We are not the people who, do the work. Most of the people that are on the board are involved in some sort of project and things like that. But we are community driven, but we are not the ones who, you all are doing the work. Like the open source projects are the ones that are out in front. They're the ones who make this community. We're here to support because we believe in the mission of what's happening here. And so going back to this idea, the mission of NumFOCUS is to promote open practices in research, data, and scientific computing by serving as a fiscal sponsor for open source projects and organizing community-driven educational programs. So what does this mean? I want to break it down just a little bit. Fiscal sponsor is a term of art. I just want to mention this. This is a legal term. It does not mean that we are the ones who pay for all of these projects and all of these things. We are a nonprofit organization that's able to act as a fiscal entity for projects. That means that projects need money. They absolutely need money. They need other sources of funding in order to come in. But we can do grant administration. We handle, tax reporting. We do making sure that things are in order on the back office. The whole idea is to provide these services that make it possible for the technology to move forward. And so this is what creates the stability. And like I said, going back to the idea that something like this being community driven is huge. It's developers who came up with this idea that they needed needed an independent area to provide this home, right? And it was definitely something that I was very interested in from the very beginning and wish that we had had a lot sooner. So I mentioned this a little bit. I'm so sorry, I am running out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of our services and everything. But obviously we provide legal services, financial services, operational services, all of these things that people don't want to do. I do want to mention licensing and trademarking though, because I think a lot of people forget about this, that part of an open source project is building a brand. Like if you have, everyone wants their software to be used, but if you have people who are infringing upon the name of your project, how are you ever going to be able to build that brand and be able to say, like, this is the project that you're working with? It's quite possible without trademarking and copywriting and licensing and all of these things like that, that you could have somebody just start a company called Scikit-Learn, and they could just do that. And suddenly they are the people who would be known as Scikit-Learn. But protecting that brand, protecting the idea of what it is and what this stands for, I think is really, really important. And so, sometimes people are like, oh, well, you're just trading logos or you're making sure that people aren't misusing things. It goes a little bit deeper than that, because branding is really important. If you don't have users, you don't have a project. I mean, you can continue to build anything you want out in the open, but most of us want others to use what we're doing. We want to be able to get that adoption. We want people to be moving forward the conversation. So I just want to point that out. We also handle contracts, agreements. I mentioned tax reporting, technical infrastructure. A lot of the documentation websites are hosted by us, and we're all behind Cloudflare and making sure that things are up and running. And then obviously conference and event planning. I think some people may or may not be aware of the fact that this is a NumFOCUS event. Like, you all have your lanyards that say NumFOCUS. PyData and NumFOCUS is the same people. It's the same entity. It's not anything different. People always ask me about the relationship between those things. The same people that are working in the NumFOCUS, they're the ones who are putting these on. These are NumFOCUS employees right here. And so moving on from that, I'm actually going to move forward a little bit faster. But the PyData conferences are obviously really important. Obviously, you all find value in being here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But this is an opportunity for us to get developer communities, user communities in the same room and have a conversation. Because a lot of the technologies that people are using on the user side are not necessarily the same technologies that are used in order to create the libraries. And so understanding better what people's needs are, understanding better what needs to happen on a project, who is using it, who is your audience, what they have to say, and then also recruiting into your projects are very, very important. So once again, thank you to everyone for being here, and then also for participating as developers and speakers and all of the other wonderful things that are happening. I'm obviously very biased, but I love this community. I just think it's amazing how far we've come and what we're able to do. As part of this, I also do want to mention that the PyData conferences, some people are not aware that we make money off of these conferences in order to subsidize all of those services that we're offering the fiscally sponsored projects. So the money that you're spending to come to PyData, part of this is for sure going into things like our small development grants. It's going to support our staff. It's going to support other events. It's going to support legal services for projects. So we have a little bit of a trade-off going on here where we have income streams that are coming in so that we can charge less money to the open source projects for the services that we are providing. And I think that's a really important trade-off for people to understand is that, when you go to an academic institution, and this is no knock on academic institutions, but if you were to receive a grant, for example, you could be paying upwards of 50 to 60% of your grant in grant administration fees in order for you to have that for your project, which is the norm at this point, right? But if you have an outside project and you're working through an entity like NumFOCUS, we would charge 15% in order to administer that grant because we're able to subsidize it through other income streams. We're able to do all these things, and we're getting, the primary function of us is to be a fiscal entity. So we're really pretty good at handling this, I think, at this point. There's always a few snafus, but we're the amount of money that's flowing through to the projects and to the organization is astounding at this point. Starting with just a few projects, moving up to almost, 120 projects at this point. It's scaled to a degree that we have millions of dollars flowing directly to projects, as it should, with trying to keep our overhead as low as possible in order to be able to provide those services. So from here, obviously I mentioned PyData. I'm going to skip all of this. You already saw the meetup map. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges for the future. So some of the challenges, especially for the NumFOCUS organization that we want to get into, global diversity is a big issue. This is computers in general, by the way. It is very English-focused. Most programming languages are very English-focused. Most of the open source community is very North America-based in general. It's hard for us to be able to represent as a global community. And I think that making sure that we have better global diversity is an important thing that we want to do. Obviously, we have foreign events. JupyterCon is taking place in Paris. That one's coming up. We have PyData Amsterdam. PyData London is coming up. PyData Tel Aviv is coming up as well. So we do have global events, but trying to make sure that we have some cohesion between the community worldwide is something that we're going to get better at. And so the other one is communication. So promoting the projects and building bridges between developers and users. This is something that is an ongoing conversation. There are a lot of different flavors of open source. There are things that are within the mission of NumFOCUS, but there are other, I think that you see the passion for open source across the entire community. And so making sure that we have those bridges, that we are able to create more communication is really important, I think. And that goes back also to language barriers and making sure that we have avenues for people to talk to each other. We do have Slack channels, we do have blogs, we do have comments coming in, that we do see kind communication happening on GitHub. Those are all important parts of communication. Balancing. I mentioned before, the bomb of data science has changed a lot of the scientific community. You see this absolutely everywhere. We are a scientific computing organization. That is our mission. So, you know, AstroPy, SunPy, Worldwide Telescope, all of these scientifically oriented projects sometimes I think get a little bit, you know, forgotten in the grander scheme of something as big as Dask and Jupyter and IPython and NumPy and all of these other projects that are making a lot of money out there. I mean, and so making sure that we are in the position that we can provide services for the large projects and also the smaller projects in a way that makes sense, so that we're making sure that we're serving both populations. I don't want to call it both. There's not a divide there. But at the same time, making sure that we are being fair in the way that we are balancing these things. Open data, I think you've probably noticed that we are very software oriented. As part of those tenets of open science, we want open data. So is there a possibility for us to add data projects into the NumFOCUS ecosystem? I think there might be. We don't know. We'll see. But there are some licensing issues around that because we're pretty familiar with software licenses at this point, but data licenses can be a little bit more tricky, especially if people are, you know, trying to change data and all sorts of other things like that. So, but repeatable open science requires access to data. Sustainable funding. This comes up all the time, and I mentioned this yesterday if anyone was at the panel as well, that finding areas of sustainable funding is a chore every single year. It is just unbelievable. I think some people think of NumFOCUS like, oh, they fiscally sponsor all of these things, so obviously they've got a ton of money and they're just giving all that money to the projects. That's not the case at all, right? We help with fundraising, we provide fiscal, a fiscal entity, but everyone is always raising money for projects. And so sometimes people are really surprised when they hear about a really popular project like NumPy. It's really relatively large user community, but the core development community is very small. And I can't speak for all of them, but I'm pretty sure they're not all millionaires. So, oh gosh, sorry, this is not good. But anyway, and also just for us to keep our lights on, I do think that we have very low overhead as an organization, but we do scramble quite a bit in order to find sponsors that repeatedly give us money, that we have constant revenue streams that are coming in so that we can provide better service to all of the projects. Scaling, I mentioned before that we're at 120 projects. We're going to keep adding projects. We're probably going to slough off some that go inactive, but we are, continue to grow. As you can imagine, that when you're scaling, if you have processes that are, could be changing at the same rate as the number of people who are joining your community, we have higher and higher overhead, which is not something that we really want to do. As leader of a data organization, obviously, we need data transformation. We've been talking a lot about this, that we are not a small organization anymore. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out there, that if there are any data scientists who want some practical experience and want to work with me personally, you're more than welcome to contact me, and we will do a data transformation on NumFOCUS. And yeah, like I said, practical experience working with somebody who's very experienced in the area, and for sure, doing a really good thing for the community. And security is another one that I wanted to mention, because especially with some of this legislation that's coming down out of Europe, this is becoming a bigger issue. So, hang on one second. I just want to make sure I actually call this the right thing. But it's the the Cyber Resilience Act and the Product Liability Act. In Europe, what they're trying to do is pass legislation in order for there to be responsibility when bugs are causing issues in software. So I think this is mainly towards data breaches and huge security holes and things like that, that someone needs to be liable for what happened. By the way, this is actually legislation that was discussed in the United States, or at least the core of it was discussed in the United States and shot down during the Clinton administration. So it's not a new idea, but it's definitely gaining traction. But like we saw with GDPR, what's passing in Europe is going to affect us here as well, because we have to be compliant. It's not possible for us to shut off the hose to all of Europe. And so it's not like we can just suddenly say, oh, we're just not going to distribute any open source into the European area. When these laws were drafted, I don't think that they took open source into consideration when they were looking at these things, because, for example, if we do have 60 financially tied projects to NumFOCUS, that is a lot of exposure to risk on our part, obviously, as the fiscal entity for each one of those. And so hopefully there will be exceptions. I think that this is an ongoing conversation, but the PSF put a statement out about this recently, but it is something that's coming up more and more. But also there are task forces that are being discussed about how to address security issues in open source projects. I know it's something that came up quite a bit when I was running a team, and people would ask, oh, is it okay for me to use this project in my code base, because isn't there a security risk there? So there's a barrier to adoption there as well. But we do need money to pay developers to do security fixes. This is a really big deal. It's, it doesn't just happen for free. And so that is definitely one of our challenges for the future. But I'll go ahead and end there. I know I'm a little bit over time, but please, a huge thank you to all of our sponsors, to our staff, to our board of directors, our advisory council. I do want to mention, by the way, our staff, they're paid, yeah, but I mean, the rest of us aren't. I don't get paid for doing this. I'm a volunteer just like everybody else. Our board of directors, we're all volunteers. Advisory council are all volunteers. Our committees that are out there, fantastic committees, all volunteers. And so we have hundreds of people who make this community possible, if not more than that even, right? But also just being advocates, donors, champions. I think that especially the passionate users of these projects have a great influence on how things are going to move forward, and how they can influence not only adoption of projects, but also the sustainability of the projects themselves. If they can show the value of using projects, it's likely that we can get more sustainable funding into the community. And so with that, I'll go ahead and stop. But thank you so much for having me, and I will be available for questions afterwards.